Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. My name is Molly. I'm an executive fellow for the Everett program where I manage the Gateways project. Gateways is a team of undergraduate students that are plugged into local community groups and projects to support those impacted by mass incarceration. We teach digital storytelling and design both inside county jails and in our own classes online. We also organize quarterly events to bring conversations about mass incarceration to our community. This year, we are also a part of the Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition, which organizes against the devastating COVID-19 outbreaks across the CDCR. And the coalition is currently supporting an ongoing action called 100 Days of Freedom to put pressure at the local and state levels to ensure immigrants are not funneled into ICE custody after they complete their CDCR sentences. This week, we're sharing the story of Gabriela Solano, an incarcerated survivor of domestic violence, who will face an ICE transfer on her first day of freedom unless Governor Newsom intervenes within the next 2 weeks. If you'd like to take a few moments to advocate yourself and amplify Gabriela's campaign, please visit the link that Louise just posted in the chat. All right. With that, from everyone on the Gateways team, we're excited to welcome you into our conversation today and hope you'll join us for the rest of Reimagine Everything. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we are digitally gathering is the unceded territory of the Awassa-speaking Yupi tribe, the Amamutsan tribal band comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Now, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today, Sophia Pugliati, to introduce our speakers.
Hi, thank you, Molly. My name is Sophia, and I'm a current fellow in the Everett program. I've been working with the Gateways project for about 6 months now, and I'm thrilled to be moderating Gateway's first speaker series, Reimagine Everything. We are super excited today to be joined by Adnan Khan and Micah Herskind. Both are active in abolitionist organizing. Adnan is the executive director and co-founder of Restore Justice, and Micah is part of the Southern Center for Human Rights. Now I'd like to invite our speakers, Adnan and Micah, to introduce themselves to the audience a little bit. Micah, maybe you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Micah Herskind. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm really grateful to be here with you all tonight and really grateful to the organizers of this event. There's so much unseen and just behind the scenes labor that goes into making things like this happen. So really grateful to you all. As Sophia said, I am a policy associate with the Southern Center for Human Rights, as well as an organizer with a group called Georgia Freedom Letters, which is focuses on building inside, outside, as in prison and out of prison pen pal relationships. We work to support those inside, supporting inside organizing and survival efforts. And yeah, just really, really excited to be here with you all tonight and excited to learn from the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Adnan Khan, as Sophia, again, you mentioned, I'm Executive Director of Restore Justice. Our work is specifically, well, a lot of things, but specifically to reframe and kind of share a different side of what people consider violence and how to respond to quote unquote violence and harm. Specifically in our work, we talk about life sentences. Myself and a couple of my colleagues that are on our staff were sentenced to life, and we work hand in hand collaboratively with people who have lost loved ones to violence. And what we've learned is in our work how the system, the carceral actors have taken this understanding of what safety and what needs and how to repair harm, what all those things mean. They have kind of not just co-opted, but created this entire system of policing and prisons. And so we want to not just frame that, but share the truth around what quote unquote violence is, why people commit harm, and what the needs are of people who commit harm. And again, a specific lens towards life sentences.
Great, thank you both. So yeah, I think we're going to get started now. Our first question today is for Adnan, which is, calls for police and prison abolition have become increasingly common in the last year. At the same time, we were being inundated with images of crime and punishment in media, from politicians to white supremacists. How do we demand accountability outside of the carceral system?
Yeah, I think accountability, if we're trying to hold people, if I'm understanding this question correctly, if we're trying to hold the system actors, carceral actors accountable, um, I I think that's like step 3, 4, 5, 6, or something like that. The most important thing would be for us to build our own power, right? We need to understand what we need as people, and then create that foundation out of those needs, and then build from there. And I think I'm to a point where I'm kind of tired of waiting on. Well, someone said this other. I'm using their quote, said quote unquote white understanding, and and it's been so long that I think a lot of us try to not a lot of us, but I think one of the strategies has been to reform the system, to work from within the system, and I'm finding out that trying to hold the system accountable without um, any building any base power with the community is it does not work that way. It has not worked that way. So I would take a step back and say to organize locally, locally, and then statewide, nationwide, and there are steps to do that. So I think that in order to hold someone else accountable, I think more so like what can we build for ourselves, and how can we create that foundation for ourselves to address our own needs first. And then you mentioned media. You know, a book that I'm reading around organizing, they talk about again, create your own pamphlets, create your own working docs, create your own tools, create your own. Now we're in the age of social media. Create your own videos. You could do it from your phone, audio, video, print. And I think as we build that base and grow with each other and evolve and expand, then we can start having our own. Not just our own media, but our own information, our own research, and that way we can spread that out. So again, holding the system accountable, holding the media accountable, there are ways to do that, but I think it's more important to build our own power first and build our own base first.
That's great. I think, yeah, it's really hard currently to be able to hold big systems accountable. Could you maybe talk about experiences you've had in smaller, maybe one-on-one interactions about how you hold people accountable or how people hold you accountable through non-carceral systems?
Yeah, I think it goes right back to what the needs are, and it's hard to blanket this because different people, if there's a harm that has happened, what was the harm done? You know, the question that I would want to ask is, what was the harm done? What is the need for the person who has been harmed? And then the person who has done the harm, and I'm saying person, it could be multiple, right? It could be persons. But for the sake of this question, I'll make it singular. And then understanding the person who has done a harm, why, what are the needs there? And then what does healthy accountability look like? I don't believe in punishment because punishment, even the root word is inflict pain. So I wouldn't want to inflict pain on somebody. I understand that hurting people further does not help restore anything or anyone. So I think for me that holding an individual accountable is not a one-sided thing. It's more of a communal thing. And I a lot of times I refrain from comparing us to European countries, but there's one thing that they do say is when someone commits a harm as a collective, the society should ask, and this is not rooted in European countries, this is traditional, sorry. One thing that people ask is, how did we fail one of ours, right? So it's more of a collective accountability versus an individual accountability.
Thank you. And are there any examples you can think of, maybe on that you've personally seen or had happened to you, where you felt there was accountability that was justice and transformative without being punishment? Maybe something in your past or something that maybe something you wish you could see more often? Oh, you can't unmute? Okay, let me see if I can unmute you. 1 second. That.
There you go.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so there was, it reminds me of a little bit after I got out, which was 2 years ago. We were working with in the Bay Area with a bunch of youth, in the community. Several of us who were previously incarcerated would either speak to the youth in the community and or in the quote unquote juvenile hall in the Bay Area. And there was a situation where there was this youth who there was a garage that was in, and this young individual went into the garage and stole a bunch of things that were in the garage and got caught, right? And so the person who was in the home was frightened. Obviously, like someone came into the garage and they stole something, but they didn't want to necessarily call. They knew who the individual was because it was a neighborhood. They knew who the young person was because it was, like I said, in the neighborhood. So they want to call the police, and they had what they call, the people from the community try to seek quote unquote accountability. And what we learned was that this young kid just needed, like, that's how simple it was. Just food. Wanted to just eat, so wanted to get whatever property that this young kid could get and sell it and buy food. And it was as simple as that. So once the other part of our party went to the lady whose home it was and kind of described, like, there's some other things that were recovered, but this youngster did it for such and such reasons. There was a much different understanding of what accountability looked like after that. And not only did she just said, okay, it's okay, I don't want the rest of the stuff back. How can we help this youngster? So again, when I say accountability, it's not just that I need accountability from the person that was harmed. It was a collective accountability of how do we provide the needs of this youngster. If it's just food, what can we do in the community to provide this young kid food? Usual response, not just usual, but the response is call the police, incarcerate this kid, put a record on this kid, and from now, that's it. That child is from forever in the system and labeled a criminal, a violent criminal, and these labels are going to be put on this kid. So again, did we need the police in that situation? No. Was accountability handled without police and prisons? Of course. And again, like I said, it was the needs of this youngster of needing food. And I don't want to get too deep into this kid's story because it gets a little graphic and sad, but just in the very surface, that's where that's one example that comes to my mind.
Thank you. I think you pose a really important topic of just that accountability is not a one-on-one interaction. It's a community-based situation. Micah, is there anything you would like to add to this?
I'm over here just taking notes. Yeah, no, I think that what Adnan said about the kid needed food. Sometimes as some of these terms have gone mainstream, there's a tendency, and this is something that Miriam Kaba says, like there's this tendency to think that everything needs a process or everything needs this like drawn out response. And sometimes that's not it. And so, yeah, sometimes people have really concrete needs. And, we can point to, and then just the one other thing I would say is like, there are these, there are instances that are obviously sympathetic of, people coming from a deep place of need. And then people often, want to talk to abolitionists about, well, what about violence? What about serious harm? And absolutely, it's important to take those things seriously. We also need to recognize that, intervening earlier often stops serious harm from happening. And so, if we want to take serious harm seriously, sorry, that's one way of doing it. And that's sort of a premise of transformative justice, is transforming the conditions that lead to harm in the first place. So yeah, just really, really grateful for everything that Adnan just shared.
Great, thank you both. I think we'll move on to our second question, which is directed at Micah. Can you discuss some of the ways policing has become a part of our culture and how it can surface in one-on-one interactions? How can we break down our inner cop or break down the question of our inner cop and the urge to call policing on each other?
Yeah, so I'm going to take that in parts, and if I go too long, just tell me. But so thinking about, how it's become a part of our culture, I think the first thing I would say is that, it's always been this way. Policing has always been a part of our culture. It's actually the basis of our culture in a lot of ways. And by that, I don't just mean like the institution of policing, the people in police clothes with a gun that we think of. And so scholars of policing and abolitionist organizers are really clear about the fact that, in the US, white people have always been empowered to police and punish and kill Black people, especially. And that was long before the institution of, police as an institution were created. And that's actually the way that policing developed in sort of a formalized sense. And so really policing was a formalized version in the 1800s of slave patrols and the suppression of the working class, which were happening before we had policing. And so I think in some ways, really the arrow runs the other way, where a culture of policing and, a system of white supremacy and racial capitalism, those things built the institution of policing. And that those systems have never ended. They've continually reinvented themselves. And so, we can point to policing, but also, how do we police each other outside of policing? We can trace sort of the extrajudicial or sort of outside the state, but of course always endorsed and facilitated by the state. We can trace that kind of violence from, again, the slave patrols to lynching, white racial violence, and today to all of the ways in which white people especially are still empowered to do the work of policing. And so here in Georgia, I'm based in Atlanta, Ahmaud Arbery was killed by two white men who invoked the Stand Your Ground law, which was a law written into existence to facilitate and enable violence against Black people. And we've seen many times in many states, we've seen this used many times in many states. And then of course you see all the ways in which white people call the police on Black people, right? We have all of the different hashtags for all of the violence that occurs where, white people are really acting as an extension of the police in a lot of ways. And so big picture, I think, policing as a cultural institution that extends beyond the police itself, the police officers, are really a defining feature of our system. It's been written into law, and it's definitional to the US, where you don't have to be the police to be the police. And so then, of course, that extends, I think, into our personal relationships, where we live in a culture with an incredibly punitive mindset. I was just reading Miriam Kaba's new book, so it's really on my mind, and she talks about how punishment extends into every other governing institution in the US. So the logics of surveillance and punishment and captivity and control show up in government assistance and social work and healthcare and education. It's everywhere. And so the fact that punishment is everywhere, I think, means that we're really not equipped by the system with the tools to handle conflict and harm. And so, it makes sense that we then replicate these logics and practices of punishment in our interpersonal and one-on-one relationships. And so through workshops with transformative justice practitioners like Mia Mingus and Shannon Perez Darby, I've learned that we're really not very good at doing conflict. Our impulse is to punish, to expose or to dispose, and really, when we commit harm, to avoid taking accountability for it. And so I think, we need to learn how to apologize well and how to change our behavior. The things that Adnan was talking about of, what are the concrete things that we need to change. And so then I think that's maybe a segue into the second point of how do we break it down. And how do we name that cop in our heads and break it down? I think that there are some really serious conversations right now happening in abolitionist spaces about how do we uphold consequences and encourage accountability, especially with people who have continually caused harm and act abusively in organizing spaces, for example, while resisting punishment. So how do we distinguish between consequences, accountability, and punishment, and how do we resist disposability while building safety? And these are questions that I think people are working out together, and it's messy, but and I think that sometimes with some of the mainstream conversations about restorative justice and transformative justice, we sort of lose sight of the fact that these things are not one size fits all solutions. They're going to look different. We were just talking about different situations need different responses. But then, sorry, to zoom in, to be really concrete about, how do we question that instinctual policing and really break it down? Some things that I just want to highlight that I found helpful and that I've learned from abolitionists who have come before us. The first I'll say is that we have to prepare. We can't wait for bad things to happen in our relationships or our organizations or any formation that we're a part of, and then figure out how to respond in a non-punitive way. Because if we're just reacting, there's a good chance that we're going to go to what feels most familiar. And again, that is a punishment disposability mindset. And so we have to be really proactive and really build our capacity to respond to harm. And so we need to create a plan. And of course, we'll never be able to foresee every problem, and there's no one size fits all solution, but we can be prepared. And so in a group that I organize with, at the beginning of us really sort of committing to organizing together, we had a weekend Zoom retreat, unfortunately Zoom, and we talked about sort of our community agreements and what we expect of ourselves and each other. And we talked really sort of specifically about what processes are we going to put in place to respond to potential instances of harm, and how are we going to work out conflict when it arises. And so that's the first thing, is just preparation. And I think then second, sort of in line with preparation, we really have to build up our skills and practice those skills in really concrete ways. And so, like I mentioned, even just taking workshops on how to practice accountability, on how to understand what accountability is, how to apologize well, those have all really been formative for me, because our system teaches us to avoid accountability. Prisons don't create accountability. I've seen Adnan tweet about this a lot, and it's always very compelling, right? Like, there's no accountability to be found in the prison. That's not what the prison teaches, or what it instills in us. And so really sort of concretely learning how to take accountability, how to apologize. I think there are growing pains to that, because it can really suck to take accountability, because it involves acknowledging that you hurt someone, and none of us want to think of ourselves as people who hurt other people, even though of course we do. And so I think really building up our muscles around accountability and building our skills on how to respond to harm is really important. And then the last thing I'll say, sorry if I'm speaking fast, is I think that, so we refer to it as the cup in our head, which is absolutely appropriate. But, though it's in our head, but I think we need to recognize that we have to root it out together. We're not going to individually figure out how to get rid of the cup in our head. And so I think we have to work through these impulses toward punishment and disposability, and recognize that, all of this is really messy, and it's, sometimes not going to go well when you try to respond to harm. There have been instances, and people that I organize with, where something has happened, and we've tried to seek accountability from the people who have, caused harm, and that person has not been interested, and it's against our principles to call the police. So of course we're not going to do that. But recognizing that, like, this is really messy and not clear cut, I think is important. And so, yeah, I think that focusing on how we find these answers together is really important, especially in our communities and our institutions. In my church right now, we're having sort of a conversation series about what it looks like to practice abolition and really interrupt policing as a congregation. So not just big picture in, like, how do we stop calling the police, and how do we how do we stop ourselves from interacting with the carceral system, but then also really interpersonally. So how are we going to break down hierarchy within our institution, and make space to hold conflict and apologize to each other? And so that might have been a little rambly, but those are some thoughts.
That was great. No, there was multiple times just like mic drop moments, just like a full statement that just I completely agree with, and it's just beautifully put. That really leads directly into our next question, but I want to give some space to Adnan if you want to add anything.
I'll call that a Micah drop, right? Because that was Micah's. You laid it all out there. I would be foolish to try to add something else to that. So I would pass.
Okay, I like that. That can be a new phrase, a Micah drop. It fits right in. Okay, great. So our third question for Adnan is, what does it look like when a community cares for one another without relying on police? What accountability strategies can we use to build towards these future communities?
Yeah, I'm going back to the needs part, because when I think about for myself, by the time I was 17 years old, I was a parentless, homeless / unhoused, and high school dropout by the time I was 17 years old, or I didn't finish school. And with layers and layers of trauma, abuse, neglect. by the time I was 17. And so what I needed was housing. Literally, I was sleeping in parks, tennis courts, couches, friends' couches, houses, just cars, just wherever I could as a teenager. And so for me, the police didn't fulfill that. Mentorship, I didn't have any mentorship, positive role model mentorship or community who I could turn to at that time, because I was moving around and bouncing around trying to find somewhere to sleep. Police didn't provide that for me, because that's not the function of the police. So eventually, by the time I was 18 years old, under those conditions, after I committed harm, that's when police showed up. And all of a sudden, the state has our taxpayer dollars. And I always say nothing is government funded, everything is taxpayer funded. A lot of people always say government funding, keep putting power in the government. The truth is that's our money, right? Like we're working and we're paying for that. So we're paying for police, we're paying for prisons, we're paying for danger, we're paying for lack of safety. Instead is being co-opted and saying that what we are paying for is policing and safety. So again, in my situation, the police showed up. After I committed harm. And that's when there was $80,000 a year in California to put me in a prison, right? And I don't consider that housing, but there was a bed all of a sudden. There was 3 very, very flimsy meals that cost approximately $3.80, I think, total, to give me some type of food. But nonetheless, it came from us, the taxpayers. So the needs that I had were still not met, and they came way, way later. So community, education, the school to prison pipeline, we could talk about that too, which was a big part of my suspensions, expulsions, detention. Those are all responses of me acting out my emotional trauma as a kid, as a teenager. So when we talk about how do we have a community that cares for each other, I'm using this term success very loosely. So my success, my health has been everything away from the system. Education wise, when I was incarcerated, they didn't provide education. Maybe there was actually, I got my GED in jail, in county jail. And I remember signing up for that. And the homework that I would turn in, they would barely look at it. And now that I understand, as I grew older, understood the system more, it was to get their numbers up, probably to get their funding, their education in the jail funding, right? And I know even at 18 years old, at that time I was 21 when I got my GED in jail. I knew that this was not the education that I needed. This is very poor education. It's not helping me. I'm just mailing this in for a certificate. So I had to learn on my own. And when I got to prison, there weren't any programs, any type of groups. There wasn't education. So what I would do to learn on my own would read books. I would take pieces of paper, rip them up, take shampoo or deodorant stickers as tape, and put definitions or quotes or things in my cell, so I wouldn't be staring at a wall or daytime TV that's in my cell, right? I would just look at the walls, stare at definitions or those quotes or things that made an impression on me, and try to study with my cellmate. So again, like even my education that I got through my incarceration didn't come from prison, didn't come from my incarceration, it came from myself or my colleagues, my currently incarcerated colleagues. The other part was any type of support, emotional support, came from incarcerated people, my mentors that shared how to survive in a prison, meaning emotionally, how to survive spiritually, how to work out properly. All those things that didn't come from the prison administration, that came from my incarcerated peers. So all my mentorship, education, spirituality, everything that I feel like I needed just to get to the next day or the next moment came from my incarcerated peers. But what that means is not because we were incarcerated, because my needs of mentorship, love, care, genuine care, yes, in a prison setting, but the genuine care that I needed, that's where it came from. Fast forward, when I was resentenced after spending 16 years inside, my life sentence was vacated, and the judge said, I'm not putting you on parole or probation. So once I got out, I was not under the restriction of parole or probation. My housing and employment came from outside of the system. It came from community. I was given safe housing, proper employment that's sustainable from the community, not from prisons, not from probation officers or parole officers, but from the people in the community. So everywhere in my life, the things that I needed never came from police, never came from prisons, have always come from the people in the community, which means I did all 16 years in prison, being unhoused as a teenager, all this stuff that I actually needed, that we're told that policing and prisons that will provide you, they did not. So I'm rambling. Micah, you weren't rambling. I know I'm rambling. I'm going to pause there for a second. If you have any follow-up questions for that or anything if you have any clarifying questions, I'm happy to answer. But my point is that everything that that you see me here today, smiling, laughing, being emotionally stable, financially stable with the job I'm in, and proper housing has come from relying and being, my crutches have been the community and have been love and care.
That was beautiful. Yeah, I think just like pointing out that having your basic needs met is really what, it's how we care for people and how we prevent, potential crime, and how we make sure people are stable and can provide for themselves and be happy. Do you have any maybe direct specific examples of accountability that provide for our communities? Or maybe talking maybe more about your experience and how your communities provided for you? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, one quick example is my friend, my coworker actually, who he and I did time together as well. He just texted me before I jumped on here, and he says, I'm finally off parole. And it's been 3 years. He's been out 3 years. And I remember when he first got out, I was still inside actually. He got out before me. And I told him to reach out to, I had started this organization while I was inside. So there was already like a few of us, or a few people that were working and building community and legislative work. So I told him, hey, reach out to some of my, at that time, coworkers. And I remember when he got out, he was incarcerated since he was 17. He was actually commuted by the governor of California, meaning like, it's almost like winning a lotto for the governor to give you mercy and say, you're not serving a life sentence anymore, I'm going to release you. And he goes into parole. Parole puts him in a transitional housing, and they won't allow him to use a cell phone after a certain time. There's a blackout period that they call it. After 8 p.m., you can't be on a cell phone. You have to sit in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous groups. You're not, anywhere you go, you have to get a pass. And it doesn't matter, even if he went to his family, because his family lives in a low income neighborhood that he grew up in, his mother, he was unable to go see his mother. So it was just all those things that, parole, even though he was incarcerated since he was 17, did 20 some odd years, 23 years, they still restricted him and made him go in. He hasn't had a sip of alcohol since he was 17 either. And so he came to our work and came to my coworkers and colleagues, and he just wanted to intern. And he wanted to intern, one, to get away from that space, but also what he needed was community. And from then on, we were able to give him a job and work on getting him out of probation or parole, I'm sorry, and giving him the things getting him away from that specific housing that he was at into a safer place where again, going back to the needs, what his needs were to be addressed. So when you said like, what is something that we can provide? Again, it's hard for me I'm giving you one example, like that kid I told about earlier. There's one example of so many. But this is the one that comes up to my mind because he just texted me he's finally off parole, and all the great work that he is doing. He's just proud of being part of the community of the organization that we work towards. So again, it's hard giving you one example because every single one is different. I have other friends who got out and they have housing, but they don't have employment. But they keep getting offered by different nonprofits, healing circles. And he said, hey, I appreciate it, but I don't need healing right now, circle right now. I don't want to sit here and talk about my traumas again and everything I've been through in prison. Because the truth is, my biggest worry is employment, right? Like that's his immediate worry. That's what like stopped the major bleeding. And so there was and I tweeted about this the other day and I didn't get to clarify myself, but there is an overemphasis on just healing, though healing is important. But how about asking people what they actually need in the moment? Yeah, so I'm gonna stop there.
No, that's great. I love hearing about even the smaller examples of how you do that. Yeah, I was just thinking, Sorry, my thought just totally left my head. Micah, is there anything you'd like to add to this about holding accountability within communities?
No, yeah, I mean, like what Anand said is just so powerful, and I think it sort of speaks to like a really like a key abolitionist principle is that safety does not and cannot come from this system. You know, um, every instance of, you know, meaningful care comes from outside, and I'll just say like that's a reason to really concretely work to support people who are in prison, especially, right? You know, making, obviously prisons are such torturous places, and so recognizing that, you know, it is on those of us who are outside, and especially those who have not been incarcerated, to make sure that we are, you know, working to support those who are inside in their survival, in their organizing, in their work to get free, or to just, you know, make it to the next day. I also really love what Anand said about nonprofits offering, you know, healing circles and sort of ignoring like what the material needs are of people, because I do think, you know, this nonprofit world sometimes like mystifies things unnecessarily, you know, where we have like the big concepts that we want to push, and, you know, it's all sort of at this theoretical level for a lot of sort of the elite nonprofits, rather than recognizing, yeah, exactly what Anand said, of just there are really basic needs that we can work as a community to meet. And like that's, you know, speaking of you know, accountability, like that's what people in mutual aid groups are doing. That's, you know, people are actively meeting people's needs, and that is some of the most important work that you can be doing, because also, you know, it's also going to be hard to take accountability and pause and you know, recognize harm done and repair for it if you're also struggling day to day to survive. And so, yeah, just echoing all of that. Again, I'm just taking a lot of notes.
That's great. I think I want to highlight what Micah also just said about mutual aids. If people can support, that's something that I believe in. And I don't know if either of you wants to talk about that for a moment, but if you can support mutual aids for different people that need it right now, whatever you can do is fantastic. I also want to bring up, so, you know, in our current society, we are very individualized. How can we encourage people to care for each other for their basic needs while the media and still supports an individualized culture? I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that. Maybe Adnan, do you want to go first? Yeah, great.
I was gonna say, hey, I came off mute to say I would love to follow after Micah.
Okay, sounds good.
Sorry, could you ask the question again? I just sort of missed it.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can we encourage people to care for each other for their basic needs when our society idolizes individualism and is constantly, the media and, you know, with capitalism, it's all about individualism, but we still want to care for community. So how do we still encourage that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it requires a really sort of militant insistence on the power and the importance of collective action and collective care. And we are taught to be, you know, to think so individually, you know, where if you know, whatever successes we might find, we're taught to think that we came upon those ourselves, that we built those. And then of course, on the flip side, our system says that those who, you know, are not doing well, it's because it's their fault. It's, you know, their individual failing. And so I think that, you know, cultivating a sense of community and community responsibility for people's needs is really important. And so I think about, yeah, I think about the importance of connecting your community in any sense, whether that's you know, your close friends and your loved ones, or the people in your neighborhood, the people in faith congregations, or any other sort of form of organization, and recognizing that, you know, we do have a responsibility to each other, And there's a discourse that frequently happens on Twitter of sort of like you don't owe anything anyone. And what I've learned from abolitionists is like we do owe each other something. Like we do owe each other care and love and support. And of course that's going to look different in different circumstances. And you don't owe everybody that, but focusing on the people around you is really important. And I think that's really the only way that we're going to see change and a shift towards communal forms of care.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Adnan, do you want to add to that?
I think what's in my mind right now is about a little bit taking a quick step back to and trying to tie this together about accountability. So nowhere in the system was I told to apologize. Was I told to try to make amends, whether direct to the people that I've harmed or indirectly by other means, doing community work or mentorship. Like nowhere in the system was I asked to be accountable. And so everything that I've learned about accountability was either on my own or amongst, like I said again, community. It wasn't until I sat face to face with a survivor of harm, not someone that I personally harmed, but someone who had lost a loved one. At that time, it was her son, and sitting face to face and just understanding each other's stories and each other's needs. It became increasingly clear to me as a person who has committed harm, what accountability looks like. So I have taken a personal accountability for it. I do have remorse, guilt, even though I try to work away from like not having that burden. I can't, just if I'm being completely transparent, I still carry that. What happened now 18 years ago, I still carry that today in my heart, in my soul. March 23rd is the day that I committed the harm. So every time March comes around, that month is very dark for me. I was arrested at that time, but also like someone did lose their life in a result of my actions. I'm the quote unquote non-killer in my crime. And I don't want to get too deep into that, but it's called a felony murder rule. If you're involved in a felony, you're equally guilty of the harm. And that's the law we ended up changing here in California. So according to that law, people come to me and say, hey, but you're the quote unquote non-killer. You're the non-killer. You shouldn't have the guilt. But that doesn't take away from the remorse and the guilt that I do carry internally. But I'm saying, I bring this up because me holding myself accountable, when I sat in front of the survivor and had this healthy dialogue, she wanted to know about my childhood. And so it's one thing for me to understand, take full responsibility for what I did. Yes, on that night, I did such and such. I committed harm. I am remorseful. I'm sorry for what I did. But then when I look back at why I did it, when I look back at, I went from an 8-year-old little league baseball player to an 18-year-old with a life sentence in prison. And I talked about my layers and layers of trauma, parentless, homeless, high school dropout. By the time I was, I committed my harm. And so once I understood that, why I did what I did, there was a lot of emphasis on the system's accountability. There was a lot like, okay, that's what the survivors and victims, when I started meeting them and sharing my story, they started to get really frustrated at the system. At first, it was just the end of frustration and anger and I don't want to speak for all survivors. I'm only speaking for the few that I've had these dialogues with. It was anger, frustration towards the person that committed the harm. And there's legitimacy there. But once we started sharing why we did what we did, a lot of that started to shift on district attorneys, on the system, inadequate healthcare, substandard education, lack of things that are food, right? Food, disability justice, these things that we're all talking about now. We learned that those things could have, like what Micah said earlier, prevented harm. But going back to the concept of accountability, America refuses to be accountable. As a matter of fact, in an authoritarian, and little that I know about authoritarian, totalitarian governments, accountability is actually a threat to those types of governments, because once it's considered weak, that you've lost power once you apologize, and therefore you can't control the people of that system. So America, it's 400 years, the building of this nation, they refuse to go back. I went back and understood where I went from that 8-year-old little league baseball player to an 18-year-old with a life sentence. America refuses to do that. And they refuse to make amends for the harm that they've created this country upon, right? Indigenous people, Black people, people who were enslaved, everything that happened after the Civil War, and so tying it, I'm trying to tie this back to individualism. That's a trope. That's actually a whole, I think, a narrative used on purpose in this type of supremacist government to say that everything is about you, the individual. Lift yourself up by your bootstrap. If you succeed, like that's the example to follow. If you fail, it's all your fault, right? And then therefore we can punish you if you harm someone else. So it's actually like very, 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 in my opinion, like calculated to use the idea of individualism to move away from community, moves away from accountability and amends and changing, whether like for me, my individual behavior, or America as a nation, it's systemic behavior and harm that it still continues to do.
Can I just quickly add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
What Adnan was just saying, yeah, a mentor of mine explained it as, you know, this sort of false individualism. Essentially what we have is a system that sets people up to fail, and then we use police and prisons to pick people off one by one and tell them that whatever failure there, you know, is their fault, and, you know, they thus deserve however many years or maybe even a lifetime of suffering or death at the hands of the state, right? Like I think that's exactly right what you're saying, that, you know, the false theory of individualism is really a tool to maintain class and state and racial control, because you tell the people that you are oppressing that it is their fault that they are oppressed, rather than acknowledging and interrupting your role as the person or as the institution doing the oppressing.
Thank you both. That perfectly answers it. Thank you for sharing your experience and your thoughts on that. We're up on our final section of question, which is, when people are first coming into this work, what kind of strategies and practices do you introduce to practice transformative justice and accountability on a small scale? Adnan, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, this question, or this approach continues to evolve for me. You know, I'm learning more and more and trying to work with community and work with a lot, specifically currently and formerly incarcerated people, on abolition and moving away from reforms that are actually harmful, and reforms, as long as, you know, with an abolitionist framework, are what we should all be aiming for. Understanding progressive prosecutor, that whole concept, and how much emphasis for the last several years has, you know, funding and research and people power into just progressive prosecutors, which we've known and is based on the one individual. We're not depowering. We're not taking anything away from a prosecutor's office. We're not minimizing the scope of their office. Instead, we're more funding for prosecutors' offices so they don't send someone as long as others, right? And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. So when you said bringing people in, I think that what I'm learning, and actually what I'm trying to organize with my currently incarcerated colleagues that I left behind, is to understand abolition, and if we're going to go towards reform, at least have an abolitionist framework around that, because other than that, it will be harmful. I don't want to put more of our taxpayer dollars into police racial bias training, right? Because we saw what happened at the Capitol, right? The insurrection. That was racial bias training. If you really think about it, oh, they're white people, white supremacists, you know not to do, right? Will racial bias training in policing actually help? Will racial bias training in a prison for a correctional officer really, really help? Then the other part of it is really understanding the immediate needs of people that are suffering. You know, like a lot of my friends, they just want relief now, right? They're inside right now. They want relief now. Don't care. Like, hey, I don't care. Like, people have organized inside to get new items in canteen, in the commissary. And I understand that, because you eat the same thing, or the stuff that they give you inside, or even the things that you can buy inside, are the same thing. And after a year, 2 years, 3 years, you get tired of that chocolate cupcake. You want a red velvet cupcake. And it's sad to even think about that, right? And the reason I'm bringing this cupcake and commissary things, because I was on a call with one of my colleagues inside, and he mentions that. He's like, look, man, I get the abolition stuff, but like I don't know when that's going to happen. But right now, what we're doing is trying to get more canteen items. And now I know in my head that actually will further support the prison industrial complex, the companies that are selling these products to incarcerated people and their families and who don't have money. I understand that's going to possibly, support that system. So it gets complicated, right? Like these questions that I personally have, how to advocate for them and advocate with them keep coming up. So real quick with this conversation with the cupcakes and canteen items, he said, this is what we want to do. Everybody in here agreed we need it because we need something to survive the next day. We're tired of this chocolate cupcake. We want red velvet or butterscotch cupcake, and mine was sure, I'm not going to oppose it. I'm not in there. You are in there. I'm out now. But one thing that we agreed upon was he was like, I would love more information around the abolitionist framework around something like that. And towards if we're going to go for reforms, like what, I need more information and education around it. So in a roundabout way, my point in sharing this is that what I'm moving more and more and more towards and have been is inviting people to abolition, maybe piece at a time, because I'm afraid that if people come into reform from just reforming, it can be very harmful. I hope all of that made sense. I'm sorry I started talking about cupcakes.
No, I mean, there's no wrong time to talk about cupcakes, and I appreciate the analogy. Yeah, that was fantastic. Yeah, definitely not a rambling. I loved hearing everything you had to say. Micah, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, what I really want now is a cupcake, but yeah, so what strategies do you use to introduce people to, to encourage people to practice transformative justice? I guess I'll first say that I'm not like a practitioner of transformative justice. And so the first thing I would always say is, go learn from practitioners of transformative justice, learn about, the questions that they're asking and what they're thinking about and what things they're practicing and trying out, because the question is always, what would you do instead of prisons? And the fact is that a lot of people are doing things instead of prisons right now, and so really learning about that is important. So there's that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, there is no Bureau of Transformative Justice. It's not some professionalized thing, and it shouldn't be. It's really a lens and a set of questions and practices that we do employ on a small scale. And so one thing I'll just say is, I've learned how really central relationships are to the work of abolition, our relationships with each other, like I was saying before, with our friends and our neighborhoods and our institutions. And so, when asked where to start, Angela Davis says, you have to start where you are. And so again, what institutions are we a part of? Probably a lot of people maybe on this call are in school. And so, how does your school handle sexual violence, or how are workers at your school treated? What can you do, to increase the power of workers at your school? What cultural norms exist there that support punishment, and how could you combat them, right? If we're thinking about transformative justice as transforming the conditions that allow harm to occur in the first place, really focusing on just where you are and what are the things about where you are that, that you can intervene in. And then, in friend groups, are there really sort of concrete instances of things that need to be addressed or worked out together? Should you start a reading circle with friends to learn about how to practice transformative justice together? I think it's really often just sort of taking stock of where you are and how you're situated, and then going from there and recognizing that you'll make mistakes, but that our task really is to, learn from those mistakes and get better each time. And then the last thing I'll end on is just thinking about, when we're taking stock of our communities and where we are, that also, has to crucially must include those who are imprisoned, whether, from our communities or around our communities, people who come from our communities are maybe imprisoned across the state. And being in touch with people inside, and again, supporting people inside, doing letter writing, putting money on people's books, helping, if it's something that people inside want, organizing phone zaps where people call the prison about, something happening, right? Being alert to when people are thrown in solitary and need support from the outside to show the prisons that people are watching, whatever it happens to be. When we're thinking about transforming our communities and the people we're in relationship with, that also, abolition cannot happen without, including and really centering those who are inside, who are also part of our community.
Absolutely. I very much agree with that. And I think transformative justice is really about the individual based in the community, which in our community is much bigger than what we see. It's everyone we interact with indirectly and directly, including those who are currently or formerly incarcerated. And in order to create a just society, we need to be accountable for our actions that influence them and harm them. I want to thank you both so much for everything you had to say today. I loved hearing about it. I'm sure the chat was blowing up for a while. So I think everyone else also really enjoyed hearing from you. I want to let you guys go, but if anyone is interested in staying, I'm leading a short discussion about what we're talking about today. And before Micah and Adnan, before you guys leave, if you have any maybe like actually physical resources, websites, or if you want to link Restore Justice or link the Southern Center for Human Rights or any books you're reading, I would love to hear from you. And I'm sure people in the chat would also love to hear those resources. We have a couple more events coming up in the future, Wednesday, March 3rd and Wednesday, March 10th. And I'll be posting information in the chat about that. Thank you, Luis. And thank you guys again so much for coming. I greatly appreciate this. And I hope now since you've been following each other on Twitter for a while, now you have made this connection and you'll be able to talk more.
Definitely. I'm just going to drop in the chat a resource guide that I try to update somewhat regularly with resources that might be relevant to a lot of the things that we're talking about. So maybe folks will find that helpful. And yeah, thanks again for having us. This was really great.
Yeah, one, it was great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for thinking of me, inviting me. It was great to actually see Micah on Zoom. I look forward to for all of us meeting in person when it's safe. So thank you for that, and love organizing virtually with you all. I put in the chat just something that actually started last March. I know it's Facebook. I'm ready to delete my Facebook, so sorry for those who have deleted, and I'm sorry for still having a Facebook. But I do say that something that I'm very happy and proud about with the community is last March, when the pandemic hit the prisons, we started this Give Directly canteen page, meaning if you have a loved one that's incarcerated, you could put if you're comfortable, put their name and number, prison number or jail number, and then people who are donors, encourage them to give directly to people's canteen. So that's literally what it's called, to give direct to currently incarcerated people. And I'm very proud to say in March 1st now, in a year, $105,000 have went into people's account at $50 a piece. We don't take a cut from it. It doesn't go to us. It goes straight into the account of the person that's currently incarcerated. So very proud to and happy to say that. And there's a resource there. And I'm just going to plug that. But again, thank you everybody, Sophia, Molly, and Micah. Great to finally share this space with you.
Thank you guys both so much for being here, and thank you for the work that you guys both do. And I can't wait to see what you continue to do. One shout out, Adnan, I saw was your New York Times opinion video. I loved that. That was fantastic. I just wanted to give a shout out to anyone else that hasn't seen it yet. Look it up. It's fantastic. But I'll let you both go. And I know we only scheduled for the hour, so I'll let you both go if you need to go.
I have a 10-month-old, so I do have to go out. I honestly am eager. I'm like pulling to stay because I am very stimulated and energized. But I do have to go for the little 10-month-old, feed and put the little one to sleep. But again, thank you so much, and see you again soon or in person when it's safe.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm available to stay if it would be an all helpful discussion, but I don't want to talk anymore. I don't need to talk anymore because I've already talked a lot.
If you're willing to stay and anyone has any questions for Micah, that'd be wonderful. But also, I want to recognize your time. So, yes. Does anyone have any questions for Micah? Please use the participant feature and raise your hand, and we can unmute you.
And I also don't want to, it doesn't need to be a Q&A if I, you all should have the discussion you want to have, whatever you want to do.
Maybe I'll turn off the spotlight feature so we can all see more faces, at least. Then it makes it more of a discussion. Maybe I'll just start off because there's no participants. I was just wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about, I'm new to transformative justice and I'm new to abolitionist organizing. What are some maybe concrete steps you think you would suggest for someone that's starting off in these new fields?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is you have to do it with people. Even we're talking about individualism and the online culture, right? Like the Twitter culture, the brand building. Everyone online is an activist just because we tweet, whatever. And so I think really like concretely getting involved with an organization, joining people who are doing abolitionist work is something that I think is, especially important because, I definitely have learned so much online, but I also like sometimes you learn about the theory online, and when it comes to actually implementing it and trying to practice it, like I said before, it just gets incredibly messy and it's really hard, and our lives are messy, and so having a community of people to work those things out with, I think is really important.
Thank you for that. That was very helpful. Does anyone else have any questions or comments or something you want to discuss? I know, Naomi, you had a question in the chat earlier. I don't want to put you on the spot. Is there anything you would like to say?
I was trying to scroll up to look for all the questions in the chat that were earlier, but I'm struggling to find them now.
Yeah, I can ask my question. I was just wondering, like, how do you make it more approachable for people to ask for what you need? I know you guys are talking about how that's super important. How would you go about that? Because I think there's factors that really can stop someone from, asking for what they really need or knowing what they need in order to, not end up incarcerated or,
Yeah, sorry, I think
have a better I guess.
I don't know if it's my internet going out, or if that it got a little bit robotic at the end. But yeah, I think that how do we assess and understand people's needs? And I think I saw in your question from before, that people don't always want to share exactly what they need, and like maybe like I know that if someone just asked me what I need, like I wouldn't know off the top, like I wouldn't just have a perfect answer off the top of my head. I think that something that we're talking about in my faith community as we're sort of on the journey to become an abolitionist church is we're talking about going around and surveying our community and asking them, questions, maybe not as direct as what do you need, but rather, what are things that cause stress in your life, or what are things that might make you feel safe? How do you do you see the police in our neighborhood? Are there things that that you feel like you need to call the police for? I think being creative around asking questions that get at what people need, sort of in other ways, I think is one way of doing it. But I would also love if anyone else has any thoughts on that to hear it, because again, just one person, and there are a lot of different ways to go about doing that.
I see that Morgan has a hand raised. I think you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, cool. So to start off, I feel like
we in Santa Cruz kind of have this privilege of living in this like bubble where we're around of like-minded people, and it's really easy to talk about these things. What advice do you have for sharing abolitionist and ideas of transformative justice with communities who may not be immediately receptive or aware of them, receptive to them or aware of them?
Yeah. Yeah, that is a really great question, and definitely definitely complex. I mean, I guess one thing I think about is something that Kelly Hayes, who is a Chicago-based organizer, talks about, is that no one wants to deal with an organizer who doesn't, care about their material needs or their material survival. And so, talking to people about sort of what might sound like lofty ideas, like entering that way without first focusing on, even what Adnan was saying of like, what are some of the basic needs, and what are the things that you want to see in your community. I think that sometimes it makes sense to start the conversation not at like, have you heard about transformative justice? And, here's what it is, but rather at like, what's going on here, like what's going on in our neighborhood, what might we like to see changed, and how can we band together to do it. And in that way, I think you're practicing, you're practicing transforming the conditions where you are, but it doesn't need to be sort of explicit in that way. And then I do think there's there's use to canvassing and pamphleting and creating really digestible resources. There's a group here in Atlanta called Defund APD, Atlanta Police Department, Refund Communities, and they every weekend are out there knocking on doors, just talking to people about abolition and what they want to see and what makes them feel safe. And so I think that there are ways of going about it sort of more and less explicitly, but either way, I think the focus really needs to be on, not how you go and meet people's needs, but how within the community and as a collective, you can work to meet each other's needs. And I think that's really sort of the basis of mutual aid. And mutual aid would definitely recommend Dean Spade's new book. Mutual aid often includes political education and consciousness raising, and doing the simultaneous work of meeting each other's needs and also educating ourselves and learning together.
Thank you so much.
One thing I'd like to reiterate from what you were saying that I really kind of resonate with. Oh, great. Now I just left my brain. Somehow I'll come up with a good thought and it just leaves.
We were talking about the needs-based, just like a needs-based lens. It's such a great approach, especially when right now lots of people I think are looking for instant solutions and things like that. And it's good to start by centering yourself within the group and community that you're working with and for, even if that's or especially if that's your own.
Adding on to that, also just like the idea of transformative justice exists already within our community. And I think that's something that I'm becoming more and more aware about. It's like small aspects of that and accountability already exist. And sometimes it feels more digestible to share that with people as smaller ideas rather than like, this is a new topic that I'm going to introduce to our lives, versus kind of like highlighting and uplifting what we already do that holds people accountable without using prisons, and that is transformative justice. And those small things are oftentimes the kind of the catalyst that can create these future communities. At least what I've noticed is recognizing that transformative justice at the smallest scale and amplifying it.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Vera. I just wanted to jump in really quick. I hope I'm not being too random in my entry, but first of all, this was awesome. You guys did like an incredible job. Thank you so much for like holding the space to have these conversations. I really enjoyed listening to like everybody speak about these things, but going off of kind of like what Sophia and Molly talked about, in the sense of like, I've also been recently introduced to kind of the ideas of transformative justice and the way that we like, I really enjoyed the way that you guys kind of talked about how like punishment is such a ingrained response that we have to like any action, whether it be, you know, even personal, just friend to friend or family member to family member. And it's like kind of going off of that, I think it's really important to have that kind of lens when you're even looking at those like simple single relationships that you have with just one other person. Like I think it's really important to have those types of conversations with your friends, because I know growing up, even with friends, I would have this kind of like punishment mentality when I would feel uncomfortable being confronted about things that I might have done harm to a friend or a family member. Instead of being like, this is somebody I love and somebody that I care about, I would instantly be like, they're attacking me. They're trying to like hurt me, instead of being like, okay, let's, you know, step into another person's shoes. And I think that's like, again, that single mentality that we're kind of taught in like American society to always have, always being very like about yourself and like you have to protect yourself at all costs. It's like, you know, it's important to want to protect others, but also understand that people want to protect you as well and want to make you better. So like being called out isn't, you know, it's more of like a call in type of situation where it's like people want to, the people that love you, and even like just people in general, a lot of the time just want you to kind of be a better person in those relationships. But anyways, that was a ramble. Thanks again. You guys are super sick.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you, Vera. Sorry, that's how you pronounce your name. Does anyone else want to chime in? We'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. We don't bite. We're it's a welcoming community. Please share.
All right, well, we definitely invite you to think on any of your questions, think on this discussion, and come back, because we're doing this again on Wednesday and then again next Wednesday. Luis, if you want to drop the link, do the thing. We will be joined by a UCSC professor and another organizer from the Bay Area next week, and then by 2 other Bay Area organizers the week after that. And we'll have discussions and time to talk about this all. So we really invite you to take your thinking home with you and bring it back. We would love to hear from you. But thank you especially to Micah for staying on. We really enjoyed getting the chance to talk to you a little bit more and are so grateful for your presence. And thank you to everyone else who stayed and talked with us for a little bit. We hope we see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We did it.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.